I have many stools in my shop, and I use them all. I do my best thinking and my best work when I'm comfortable, and a stool can really help minimize stress through a long work day. For a long time, I wanted a stool with some specific features. It should have 3 legs to be stable on all surfaces. It should have large casters so it can roll easily over debris and small cracks. I want it to be quite low, and I want a built-in tray to keep my tools close at hand. Today, I'll build a stool that meets all these requirements. I'll base my design on the tray for tools. Rather than making a tray, I found this 19-inch cooking pan online, and it's ideal for this application. The casters I've chosen are 3 inches in diameter. These are large enough to roll easily over small obstacles. And this style of caster mounts by slipping inside a tube. You tighten this bolt, and the rubber core expands inside the tube to hold it nice and snug. I need to see how close I can get the caster to the tray without binding. So I made a sample bracket here that shows that minimum dimension. I'll show you how this works. So the bracket slips into place, and you can see that the caster can rotate freely without colliding with the bracket. So I can position each of these 3 brackets so it's snug up against the pan. So I'll have 3 equally spaced casters. There'll be a central tube to hold the seat, and 3 brackets that connect the central tube to each of the tubes for the casters. I'm going to make a fixture to hold these pieces of tubing in the proper orientation. My fixture is based on a piece of 3/4 inch plywood about 2 feet square, and I'm going to put a piece of sheet metal on top of that to protect it from denting. So the first step is I want to put screws in the corners of the steel to screw it down to the plywood so they can't shift. So I've laid out a hole 1.25 inches from each edge, and I'm going to drill that through first. And then I'll countersink these holes so my flathead screws will fit flush. Then I'll use drywall screws to hold this all together. So based on the dimensions of the pan and the sample bracket I made, I found the distance out from the pan where these studs need to go that hold the casters. And the distance from the center to the center of the caster is about 11.25. So I've set a beam compass to that dimension, and I've laid out 3 lines 120 degrees apart, and I'm going to make a circle on this steel plate that will show the center of where the casters will be. So the center of each caster is at the intersection of the circle and these 3 lines. So I'm going to center punch those points, drill a pilot hole, then I'll use a 1/2 inch drill bit to drill these holes through. I'll use a step drill to drill the holes in the sheet metal. And I'll deburr these holes with a countersink. I'll use a spade bit to drill through the plywood. I'll drill halfway through from both sides to help minimize tear out. And now I can screw these parts together permanently. It's time to put the caster tubes on the fixture. So I'll put a 1/2 inch bolt through that hole we just drilled. Then there's a rubber sleeve that goes over the bolt, and there's a threaded tab that goes on top of that. Then the tube goes over that rubber sleeve, and when we tighten the bolt, it expands the rubber sleeve inside the tube, making a very snug fit. So that's on there nice and tight now, and that's perfectly vertical. So now I need to think about locating the center tube that the seat itself goes on, and I gave this a lot of thought. Here's the plan I came up with. I want to get this located so it's not crooked in any direction. So I found a pipe flange at a local hardware store. I'm going to bolt that onto the base, and then I have a piece of 3/4 inch pipe that goes into the flange. I'll get this bolted down so it's nice and snug. But I made a couple of sleeves that go inside this tube, and the sleeves are a nice snug fit over the small diameter pipe. And now I can position this anywhere I want, and it's going to be absolutely vertical. So I'm going to find the center holes for the bolts that hold this flange into place. Note that I put twin lines on this so I know which way it goes back together should I need to disassemble it. And also I put a little button in the center of my fixture to center the threads on this just to get a little more accuracy. So I'll use a transfer punch to lay out the center of each of the holes to drill. I'll increase the size of those center punch marks a little bit. And I'll drill these through. Now I'll open these up to 1/4 inch. And now I can get the flange bolted into place. With the pipe flange screwed to the base, this really provides a precise location for the seat tube. So let's put this into place, and you can see I put a hose clamp on the vertical pipe to locate exactly where this goes. This is the position I like, and it's time to start designing a bracket to connect the seat tube to each of the caster tubes. So the first idea was a bracket with all straight edges, and that certainly would work fine. But as I thought more about this, I started thinking, wouldn't it be a lot more interesting if this bracket had curved edges? So I made a piece with curved edges, and I like that a lot more than I like the one with the straight edges. And then I thought, wouldn't it be great if this had holes in it as well? So here's a similar bracket with holes placed in it, and I think this is the one we're going to go with. So the idea is that the brace for each leg, for each caster, will have 2 of these plates with a space between them. And I'll show you how I'll construct each one of those. I'll use the bandsaw to cut these parts out, and I'm using 18 gauge steel. I'm going to put a curl on the top and bottom edge of each part, and I need to do that before I punch and flare the holes. I have a small roundover die set on my bead roller. This is a 5/16 radius, and I'll use this to do all the bottom edges. You can see that's a nice fast way to put an even curl on each part. Now I'll change the die to a 1/2 inch roundover die and do the top edges. And again, you can see that puts a nice uniform curl on the edge. I'll run all the parts through these dies. It's time to put the holes in these parts now. I'm using the Mittler Brothers punch and flare dies, and the first hole size is 1.5 inches. So this die set punches the hole first, and then as you keep on tightening the die, it flares the edges. It's a one-shot process. It helps to use a little bit of oil on the threads of these tools because they take quite a bit of force to punch the hole. So I'll go ahead and feed this through the part, and I'll tighten the die with a wrench. So it's just punched the slug out. Now it's going to start flaring the edges of the hole. And I'll keep tightening this until I feel it bottom out. And we're just about there. So we'll pull this apart and take a look. Sometimes it takes a little tap to release the die. And there's our first punched and flared hole. So I'll move up to the next size, which is 2 inches. Okay, that's nice and snug. So let's pull this apart and we can see the final result. So there's the panel with all the holes punched and flared. I think it looks great. I need to make a cap strip for the brace for each leg, and I want each leg to taper, so I've cut a tapered piece of metal. I'm going to use the roundover dies to curl both edges of this. You'll notice the metal is taking on a corkscrew twist. That's just what metal does when you work the edges like this. So first I'll take the twist out of this. I can do that by hand. Then I'll start putting the top curve in it. I have a little curved dolly here I'll be working over. Just putting light pressure on it to get the shape. Close enough. It's time to start tack welding these parts together. Now I'll be using the TIG welder. I'm going to make the first tack weld with no filler rod because my rod holding hand is busy aligning the parts. There's our first tack. Now I'll align the parts by hand and make the next tack weld where I have the best fit up, which is right about here. I'll start tweaking the parts and looking for the best fit up, which is right here. Now I'll go for this spot. Now we'll start the tack welding on the other side. So these pieces are nicely tacked together on the top, and now I need to make another filler piece for the bottom. One thing I'm doing differently this time is I've curved the piece before curling the edge because I found that it was hard to put the right shape in it after the edge was strengthened with the roundover dies. So this piece is a nice fit. And we'll run this through the dies. Turn it over and run the other side. So now I can tack weld this into place. So I just finished tack welding the back side, and now I can finish weld all these joints. I'd say that looks real good. 3 more joints to go. So the welds are finished. Now I can sand everything smooth. I'll start with 80 grit. Then I'll go to 120 grit. Then I'll go to 180 grit on an orbital sander. So that's a pretty rapid process, and it leaves a surface that's smooth enough to paint. Now that the legs are welded and smooth, it's time to fit them into place on the fixture. So I've already done the fitting on the first leg. You can see how it fits quite nicely, both on the outer tube and the inner tube. And now we're going to fit this tube. You can see the problem is it needs to be notched out on these 2 corners to match the radius of the tube. So that's what I'll do next. I have a clamp set up on my bench to hold the part. So I'll get that clamped into place, and then I'll draw in the radius I need to cut away. So this little disc is 1.5 inches in diameter, the same as the tube for the caster. I'll use it to mark the area that needs to be removed. I have a 2.5 inch disc on the rear, which matches the radius of the seat tube. So I'll mark that. I just need to trim this material away. Now I'm going to be using a carbide burr on an air-powered die grinder. So the front's done. Let's do the back. The bottom of this needs to be done also. So let's try this into place. It's close, but I see it needs a little more trimming on the bottom. And that is just about a perfect fit. So I have one more leg to fit, and then I can weld them together. And one more thing I want to do before I weld the legs into place is to cap these caster tubes. And I'll do that with a freeze plug that I got at an auto parts store. I think this will be a nice feature. I'll get these caps tack welded into place. And now I can finish weld it. I'll weld the rest of these off camera, and I'll sand the welds smooth. I'm ready to tack weld all the parts together now. I have to be careful not to put too much heat on these caster tubes because they still have those rubber biscuits inside them. So I'll get everything tack welded, pull this off the fixture, and then I can finish weld everything. So I finished welding all the legs. I'm going to let this cool down for a minute, then I'm going to grind all these welds smooth. I'm going to start with a small belt sander, which is excellent for getting into concave areas like this. That got rid of most of the weld. And I'll go to a small disc sander for the next step. And then I'll go to an orbital sander to blend it in. So that's a pretty fast way to smooth a fillet weld like this. So this base really is cleaned up beautifully, and it's time to mount the pan now. Remember at the start of the video I showed this temporary bracket I made? So I'm going to remake 3 of these from steel, and I'll make them long enough to meet the center of the pan. I've made 3 identical brackets, and I put layout lines on my fixture so I know how they fit together. So I'm going to get these tack welded together first, then we'll fit it to the base of my stool. It's time to get these parts fitted together. I'll start by putting the pan in this bracket I just made. And then I'll place this on top of it. And my goal here is to get the space between each leg and the pan the same. That's why I left these pieces long, to give myself a little bit of wiggle room. And it looks like that space is perfectly equal now. So I'll use a felt tip marker to mark around the perimeter of the caster tube. And my goal here is to find where to put the center of the hole for the caster itself. So I'm using a fender washer, and I'll just visually center that on this line I just made, and then mark the center of that. So now I know where the center of the hole needs to be. And off camera, I'll drill 3 half-inch holes for the caster stem. I drilled the holes for the casters, and I rounded all of these ends. I'm going to use 832 screws to hold the pan to this bracket, and I pre-drilled holes for the threads. So I'll put this bracket into place, and I'll use the tap drill size to drill through these holes right through the aluminum pan. I'm going to put threads in these holes now. I'm using a thread-forming tap, which is much stronger than a traditional tap. And these are pretty safe to use with a handheld electric drill, as long as you use common sense. Now I'll use a clearance drill for the body of the screw, and I'll drill through the aluminum pan, and I'll deburr these holes with a countersink. And now I can assemble these parts. You'll notice I marked this so I know which way it goes together. Get this fitted into place. I'll use a little tapered punch here to align the screw holes. And then we'll put the 832 screws into place. So the tray is securely held in place. The last step in fabrication is to attach the seat plate. It's a little bit challenging to get this perfectly centered, and also I want it to line up with the front edge of the casters. So what I've done to help that is I put a disc on this that's a nice snug fit inside the tube, so that centers it. And as far as the rotation, I'm going to put a clamp lightly into place to hold the plate where it goes, and then I can pivot this down so the plate touches the table and allow that plate to rotate until it's in line with these caster tubes. So now I can put 3 tack welds into place, and that'll hold it for the finish welding. The 3 tack welds will hold it securely, so I can take the clamp off now, and it's more convenient to weld this when it's upside down. Well, finally it's time to shoot some paint on these parts. I'll spray the bottom first, let that dry, then flip it over and paint the top side. It's time for the final assembly. So I'm going to put the tray on the base first. I've got a little punch here I'll use to line up the holes. Then the next step is to put the casters into place. So they slip up through this opening. There's a spacer that goes in place. Then the rubber biscuit. And then this nut goes on top. We'll do that to all 3 legs. Then we'll get the next 2 parts put together. The nice thing about working over a fixture like I did is we can be sure this will fit together. And I'll tighten each caster. And now we can add the seat cushion. So I took this off a stool I had. You can make your own cushion, or you can just use a piece of plywood. That would work fine. So we'll get this assembled now. So the cushion's in place. And there's one more step I want to do. This is kind of the finishing touch. I cut a piece of rubber that goes in the tray, and that'll protect the bottom of the tray from being impacted by the tools I put in it. So this really rolls beautifully. I love the way it's free to move in any direction. It's a nice working height. And it's a great place to put all my tools as I'm working on things. So I sure hope you've enjoyed this project. I love doing it, and maybe you can make a cool stool for yourself. I love making these videos, and I'm honored that you're watching. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell to be notified about new videos. I read every comment, and I do my best to answer all questions. If you like what I'm doing, please click the Patreon link and become one of the great people who help me create new videos.